Maybe you've heard the term insulin resistance or pre-diabetic. And if you don't really understand what that means and why it's such a big deal, this live is for you. Hello, everyone. My name is Zippi. I'm a registered nurse and certified food addiction counselor, and welcome to my weekly live. If this is your first time, then every week at a new time now on Sundays at 8 p.m. GMT plus 3, I think it is now, which is Israel time, which is 1 p.m. EST. And I go live on my social media platforms and talk about a different subject. And one of my favorite things to do is to geek out on the biology of overconsumption of sugar and why it's so harmful. Because when I learned this stuff, it was such an aha moment for me. It really changed the way I think about junk food. Because you see, I am a sugar addict, and 25 years ago, I began my recovery journey, my sugar-free journey of really abstaining from sugar. And then it was white flour, and today it's all flours, because I understood that these foods, like these junk foods, act for me, it's like drugs for a junkie, for a drug junkie, right? I'm a junk food junkie. Was never ever able to eat these foods in moderation. And when I abstained from them, and of course also learned how to deal with that life without using food like a drug, it completely changed my life. It was like I became another person when I stopped using these foods that so affected my mood, my health, my weight. But when I started learning the science behind sugar and food addiction and behind why sugar really is so bad for you and why it's so harmful to your health, physical and mental, for me, it made such a huge difference in my own personal recovery. And now that I've counseled hundreds of people, for whether it be to detoxing, the actual initial detox from sugar, and building a new relationship with food, I see what a difference this information makes for the people who learn this. And so that's why I'd like to share this information with you as well, as you are my loyal audience. So here is the whole idea. Okay, in order to understand insulin resistance, we have to understand what insulin does. Insulin is like, I guess you could say it's a hormone that is produced in our pancreas. And what insulin does is basically it takes the glucose that's in our blood, which comes from the food we eat, and it takes it out of the blood and distributes it in the body where it's needed. If the cells need this glucose for energy, then it knows how to open the key to the cell doors, right? There are receptors on the cells for insulin, and then the insulin is able to put that glucose into the cells, and the cells use it for energy. If the cells don't need it for energy, then the insulin knows how to take that sugar, that glucose, which is one of the forms of sugar, that glucose, and distribute in the body in different places. And then the body sort of saves it like a spare battery, because our bodies are programmed for lack of food, not for too much food. One of the places that insulin knows how to store the extra sugar that the cells don't need is in fat. As fat, right? Fat, basically, what is that? That's our body storing energy for a day when we will need it. Now, here's the problem, okay? Our body knows how to deal with a certain amount of glucose, which glucose is the sugars that are absorbed into the blood from foods like pasta and bread and grains and legumes too. Now, people who eat real food all these carbohydrates, what's called, which basically carbohydrates is basically molecules of sugar holding hands, right? But what makes them get absorbed gradually and not spike the sugar in the blood and therefore spike the insulin in the blood, right? Because if there's a lot of sugar in the blood, then you need a lot of insulin to get rid of all that sugar. So somebody who eats, for example, I don't know, a bowl of chickpeas. In chickpeas, there's fiber, and the fiber makes the carbohydrates in the chickpeas get absorbed gradually. So the glucose in the blood goes up gradually and then it goes down gradually. And if somebody doesn't nosh all day, right, and isn't just snacking all day, then in between the meals, all that whole insulin system rests. But what happens when somebody, for example, doesn't eat a bowl of chickpeas, but in the morning has a cookie with their coffee, and then they get to the office and somebody brought a cake that they had from their son's bar mitzvah, and so they can, it's so delicious they can not have some of that cake, and also maybe that person would be insulted. And then there's lunch at the office, and there's Chinese noodles or sushi, and then in the afternoon, you get this down, like you need something sweet and something to pick you up. So there's another cookie, or there's that chocolate, or that little bit of cake that was left over from the person's bar mitzvah, that they brought. And then you got home and it's like, you had a really hard day and maybe you're a little hungry, but it's not time for supper yet. So you start snacking something, right? And then you make pasta for the kids and you eat some of that. And then in the evening, wow, it's been a really hard day and you're sitting in the front of the TV. I want to treat myself. And then, having some chips or some pretzels or ice cream or whatever it is. Now, here's the thing. When our body is constantly 24/7 being bombarded by this insulin, the system starts breaking down. Because let's put it this way. If our body knows how to handle a lot of sugar if it happens rarely, right? Like, for example, if, there was a wedding once every few months in the shtetl in Eastern Europe or the village in Morocco or wherever it was, then the body knew how to handle that. But when it's 24/7, all day, every day, that's already very problematic. And then what happens is, remember what I said, when there's a lot of insulin being produced and being secreted and in the blood and in the system. So first of all, a lot of fat is being produced. And this is the kind of fat that gets accumulated around the belly and around the internal organs. And it's the kind of fat that promotes inflammation. But I want to give an analogy. Here in Israel, for those of you who are watching who don't live in Israel, here in Israel, we're very security conscious, as you can imagine. So every shopping center has a guard outside the door. The truth is, when I go traveling abroad and I walk into a shopping center, I automatically take my purse and open it, and there's nobody there to check it. But in Israel, every single shopping center has a guard standing there with also usually a metal detector, and you have to get your bag checked. Now, let's say the guarding company, the company that provides these guards, they know that one guard can check 100 people's bags in an hour. And the door to the shopping center is also built in such a way that it knows that on average, it needs to close and open 100 times an hour. I'm just giving a number, right? Just arbitrarily. Okay. And let's say one time 500 people went into that entrance with that guard and that door, right? In 1 hour. So maybe if it was just 1 hour, that guard would somehow manage. He'd work really, really, really hard, but he'd somehow manage. But what happens if there's one guard and one door that is meant to serve 100 shoppers an hour, and not just for 1 hour, but every day, all day, there's on average 500 shoppers an hour. Well, At some point, right? What is the guard going to do? He's going to call up his company that hired him and said, "Hey guys, bring some more guards. I need more. I can't handle this by myself." That's the insulin, right? You understand the analogy. So the company sends more guards. But if it's constantly being all these 500, 500, 500, 500 instead of, and it never goes down, at some point the company's going to say, "Sorry, we don't have the manpower for that." And what happens to the door, the entrance to the shopping center, which this would be like the cell, right? The cell's doors, like the receptors on the cell. Well, if it's been built for 100 shoppers an hour and every single hour, every single day, it's opening and closing 500 times instead of 100 times, well, at some time, what happens to the door? It breaks. And that's what's happening when insulin resistance happens. What happens is, first of all, the pancreas that produces the insulin gets tired from overproducing all this insulin all the time. At some point, it might not be able to produce it, or maybe the receptors of the cell, because what happens is our receptors on our cells, when they're being bombarded by stimulation, then they do something, they know how to protect themselves. It's called down regulation. They just become less sensitive to that same stimulus. So what happens is that the receptors, first of all, don't really react as well to the insulin. And at some point, they just start breaking down. They basically start disappearing or getting killed off. Now, if that happens and the system is working somehow okay when the person isn't eating, like a fasting glucose, right? When there's no food around that needs to be dealt with, the person will have normal glucose levels or near normal glucose levels. But when they eat, right, then the insulin goes sky high because the receptors are not working very well, and also the system is starting to break down. Then what happens is that the glucose from a meal is not being dealt with properly, and then the glucose in the blood is too high. At this point, if a person will detox from sugar, will go off sugar, or severely limit the amount of foods that spike that insulin so high, then the many times that, it can reverse itself, right? If it's like the door is being stressed, but it didn't break completely yet, right? And then it goes back to 100 shoppers an hour, then things will go back to normal. But if the person who has insulin resistance or pre-diabetic and continues eating these starchy, sugary, hyper-processed foods that spike insulin, at some point the system's going to really break down. And that's diabetes. That's when the glucose in the blood is already high, even at a fasting level. Even when the person isn't eating, the body can't deal with the glucose, with the basic glucose. That's the basis, the base rate of glucose in the blood. And that's already problematic because, sometimes people say with a low carb diet or with really strict diabetes, especially if it's type 2. I'm talking right now about diabetes type 2. Because diabetes type 1 is just like a sort of like the body works against itself and just the pancreas stops making insulin at all. And then a person has to start injecting insulin from outside because their body just doesn't know how to, doesn't produce it anymore. I'm talking about diabetes type 2, where there is production of insulin, but excuse me, but it's just not working properly anymore. That's where and before the system actually breaks down, but it's not really working properly, that's the insulin resistance. So if I'm going to put it in a slide, right? Sorry, wrong slide. Here it is, the English one. So what happens is people eat crappy carbs that spike insulin, right? And then there's too much insulin in the system. And then the cells become resistant to that insulin. And then the body needs even more insulin. And then that whole, right? And then when there's a lot of insulin in the system, then the insulin is making fat, because insulin causes the body to produce fat. And not only that, it also tells the body to stop burning the fat that it has, because it's basically like giving this like false message that there's lots and lots and lots of energy around, so we don't need it. And then what happens is people feel tired and they crave these crappy carbs, and then they eat these carbs. So here's this like vicious circle that people get into, which eventually can lead to irreversible damage. So for people who can moderate sugar, it's very, very important to know two things. First of all, the WHO, the World Health Organization, recommends no more than an average of 6 teaspoons of added sugar a day. 4 for women, 4 for women, and I think like something like 8 or 9 for men. And for children under 2, by the way, the FDA and the Canadian Health Board have recommended not to give any added sugar to children under the age of 2. But if you are one of these people who knows, maybe you know what I'm talking about, maybe you've already heard this before, maybe you know it yourself, and you see that each time you try to moderate these sugary, starchy, hyper-processed foods, and you just can't, there's no such thing as moderation, it's an all or nothing deal, well, then maybe it's time to go for the nothing. Because what happens is when people detox from sugar, if they are not able to control the amounts of sugar that they eat and they detox from sugar, and especially if they do it in time before the system gets irreversibly damaged, well, what happens is those cravings go down and you can actually break out of that vicious cycle of insulin resistance, which can lead to diabetes type 2. So, if you liked this video, first of all, I would like to know if this video was, especially if you or somebody you know, or maybe somebody you care about in your family, what have you, has insulin resistance or pre-diabetes, please show them this video. And if you liked it, well, then please like it, comment, tell me what was the main message that you got from this video. And if you'd really like to thank me for the content that I have given you, please pass it on to 2 more people and you will have my thanks, because that means it will be getting exposure to more and more people. And the last thing I'd like to say to you is, if there are any subjects or questions that you would like me to talk about on my weekly live, well, please put them in the comments below, because I am always more than happy to talk about things that people ask me about and write to me about. Have a wonderful evening and a great day, and I will see you next week on Zippi Live.